What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 292 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about JLA Ultramarine Corps. This is the first 3 issues of the JLA Classified series from 2005, I believe, written by Grant Morrison with art by Ed McGuinness, and also collected here is the JLA Wildcats crossover issue written by Grant Morrison with art by Val Zemeckis, I believe. And the premise of the 3-issue JLA Classified arc is the Ultramarine Corps, introduced in Morrison's Justice League run. They had their own super city called Superbia, floating over the ruins of Mount Video, I believe, which is a South American city that was destroyed in Justice League 1 Million. And in this story, Gorilla Grodd takes over the city and is able to use mind control to take over the Ultramarine Corps. And the Justice League, they have to stop Gorilla Grodd and his mysterious ally Nebula, who is a cosmic entity who is using these little microscopic warriors to take over the Ultramarine Corps. And this story is pretty good. It's a nice, straightforward story, the Justice League versus Gorilla Grodd. The only parts of this that you might not like are the parts that are setting up the Seven Soldiers mega series that Grant Morrison was going to be working on roughly 1 year after this came out. He might have already been working on it while this was coming out, for all I know. I don't know. But there are a lot of references to stuff that just won't make any sense if you haven't read the Seven Soldiers mega series. There is mentions of this microscopic race called the Sheeta, this Dark Queen of the Night, the Sheeta Queen. All of that stuff is just going to completely go over your head if you haven't read Seven Soldiers. And that is not meant to be an insult to anyone. It's legitimately referencing plot points that when this comic came out, those comics had not yet come out. So in a lot of ways, it kind of feels like how a lot of people complained, myself included, complained about the Batman vs. Superman movie, how it was referencing plot points that weren't going to be even set up in movies for another 3 or 4 years, but it was acting like people should know what was going on when it was setting up all this stuff that wouldn't be covered for a really long time. That's kind of like what's going on here. The stuff with the Justice League fighting gorillas wearing jetpacks, that's all really easy to understand. The stuff with these microscopic warriors and talking about how Nebula has to defeat the Seven, that's all a little bit confusing unless you've already read Seven Soldiers, which, like I said, when this miniseries came out, Seven Soldiers had not yet come out. So I imagine a lot of people were reading this because it's Grant Morrison, and a lot of people, like myself, really like Grant Morrison, and then they read this and they might have been a little bit confused. Wait, what's all this going on here? Now, Nebula is apparently a reference to a character from one of the old JLA JSA team-ups from the 60s and 70s. I vaguely remember that character. I remember the story that introduced the Seven Soldiers of Victory in the late 60s, early 70s. I don't really remember the Nebula Man, but apparently Nebula is loosely based on him. There is some other stuff in this that's a little bit confusing. So Batman has this thing called the Infant Universe of Quebec. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's basically this box. It's about, yay big, and it is a miniature universe. And the Justice League, they have gone inside this universe chasing after a serial killer who is trying to wreak some damage on this miniature universe. And Batman has this universe on his secret lab on Pluto. Meanwhile, Gorilla Grodd also has this miniature universe wherever he is, and that's how he is able to infect some of the Ultramarine Corps, and then he's able to unleash the microscopic Sheeta warriors on the rest of them. At one point, Superman calls Nebula a time-traveling bully, so presumably the adult Nebula, he is the infant universe of Quebec grown up, so he's from the future. Okay, fine, I get that, but then why are there 2 separate infant universes of Quebec? Why does Batman have one and Gorilla Grodd has the other one? All they had to do was throw in a little line and say that there's only one infant universe of Quebec, and Batman has an entrance into the universe, and so does Gorilla Grodd. That would have been fine, but as is, I was a little bit confused when I saw that Batman had this square universe that he's letting the Squire use, and then at one point Gorilla Grodd has this infant universe also. Really, this is a book that I feel like you have to have if you're interested in reading Batman or Grant Morrison's Seven Soldiers run. It's something you really should have because it sets up a lot of that stuff in the Seven Soldiers run, and it's been a while since I've read Seven Soldiers. I don't know how well that mega series holds up on its own, but all this stuff about about Nebula having to hunt down the Seven. I know all of that comes back in Seven Soldiers. So this is something you would probably want to have on your shelf if you're interested in Morrison's Seven Soldiers run. Also, this book makes use of the Knight and Squire, who show up in Morrison's Batman run, which started just a couple years after this, maybe just a year after this. I think his Batman and Son storyline started in like 2006, and I know this came out in I think 2007, or no, 2005. So anyway, the Knight and Squire, they show up here. They're part of the Ultramarine Corps. And one more thing, at the end of this miniseries, Superman is basically talking down to all the Ultramarines, saying, you guys think that killing your enemies is the option and that that's a viable solution, and it's not. He says, you cannot go around killing your enemies when we live in a world with monkeys who have jetpacks as weapons. And that's kind of a weird thing, a weird way to end this miniseries. Way back at the end of the Ultramarine Corps storyline in Morrison's Justice League run, the Justice League are saying that they're going to have to keep an eye on the Ultramarines because they could be a threat later on. And then we see that kind of sort of happen here, where Gorilla Grodd takes over them and uses them against the Justice League. And then Superman acts like them killing bad guys is the reason why Gorilla Grodd was able to take over them. And I'm thinking, I think you missed a couple of steps of logic there. It doesn't really fly that because these guys are willing to kill bad guys, that somehow that is why Gorilla Grodd was able to take over them. I can understand that Superman doesn't like that they kill people, but that doesn't have anything to do with why they were schooled like little children by Gorilla Grodd. That was a little weird. And then the Justice League, they send the Ultramarine Corps into the Infinite Universe to kind of clean things up. And at that point, I'm still a little confused on some things, because when the Justice League was in there, they were saying that we cannot use our powers publicly. The things are very delicate here, and the Infinite Universe is supposedly supposed to represent the real world. There are no superheroes in the Infinite Universe, so allegedly it's supposed to be kind of like our world, and so I guess that's why the Justice League feels like they shouldn't be using their powers. I don't really understand why they can't use their powers, why superheroes can't just show up in this universe, because in theory, in the DC universe, at one time, the first superheroes showed up in a world where there were no superheroes. So I don't know why these guys can't show up in the Infinite Universe and then use their superpowers to save the day, and then just like in the DC universe, there would be superheroes showing up for the first time. But they send the Ultramarines into the Infinite Universe, and then they're saying, all right, this is a world with no superheroes. Things are going to get interesting. And most of them are wearing their civilian clothes, and I'm thinking, why? Why can't they just be superheroes and just protect this universe with their superpowers? Why did they have to do it disguised as civilians? I think this story would have been a lot better if it had maybe one extra issue to kind of let things breathe a little bit. As is, I feel like things were moving way too fast. Anytime I had a question about anything, I didn't feel like it was answered, or it wasn't answered adequately enough. Sure, I can draw connections and I can make assumptions about something that's not answered here, but I would rather have an assurance that what I think is happening is what's actually happening, instead of just me making assumptions and saying, yeah, I think this is what's going on. Also, personally, I would have rather this had just been a Justice League story and not a prologue to Morrison's Seven Soldiers. I like his Seven Soldiers, I like his Justice League. If you're going to call this JLA Ultramarine Corps, then have this be a JLA story. Don't have this be a pseudo Seven Soldiers prequel in disguise. I will read your Seven Soldiers story, I promise you. You don't have to try and trick me into reading it by giving me this prequel that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So overall, I would say this is one of Morrison's weaker JLA stories, and I think that's largely because he doesn't give himself enough room to breathe. If this had been the first 4 issues of JLA Classified instead of just the first 3, I think maybe this would have turned out a little bit better. Those are just my thoughts on this book. I hope that you guys liked this video. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.